Hello, everyone. Afternoon, or if you may be watching this on YouTube, hello to you there. I just wanted to start by saying, a massive appreciation to Tamsin and Sam. Yeah, you could not have been more helpful in putting this together. So thank you very much for organising the session. And on behalf of Paul, myself, and the other members of our research group, we are delighted to contribute to this webinar series. We are really pleased to talk about some of our research in this space, and we'll try to keep things accessible, which is sometimes difficult for researchers. We have very niche interests in physiology, but hopefully we can keep things nice and accessible. If you have any questions that we don't get to in the Q&A at the end of the session, hopefully you can see on the screen in front of you here my email address and Paul's email address, and we'll be delighted to answer any questions over email as well. Okay, and we hope that you enjoy the session, you find it interesting, and hopefully find it useful as well going forward, or at least have a good appreciation of where we are at with our research. So as Tamsin already mentioned, Paul and I are part of the Exhibit research group at the University of Exeter. So Exhibit stands for the Exeter Head Impact Brain Injury and Trauma Research Group. And we're a collective of different scientists with a range of skills and interests. So that's quite nice. As a multidisciplinary group, we can do multi and interdisciplinary research. In other words, we can look at head impacts from a variety of different angles. So I am mostly interested in vascular function. And so in the context of head impacts and injuries, I'm interested in cerebrovascular function. So that's the health of a network of blood vessels that feed the brain. Paul, who will introduce himself a little bit later, is very much more interested in neurometabolism, so how that brain is fueled. But we have other members of staff who are interested in how body movements are controlled, so motor control, and whether or not we can measure these things as a way of diagnosing changes in brain function. So, like I said, we're a sort of a broad interest group with some staff and a variety of different PhD students. And you can see on the screen in front of you some of our current projects, or some of these projects have just recently finished. But that should give you a flavor of some of the work that we're doing. And I just want to acknowledge that much of this work is funded by, you can see our sponsors or the grants that we've secured at the top of the screen there. So it's only thanks to the investment from these groups that we're able to do that work. So thanks to those as well. Now, as Tamsin mentioned, I'm a vascular physiologist. I actually head up the vascular research group, which is another research group in public health and sports sciences at the University of Exeter. And our research group is really interested in how lifestyle exposures, which you can see in the box there, might increase or alter your risk of chronic cardiovascular disease. So let's examine that for a second. A good example is, we know that physical activity can lower your risk of a heart attack. We know that physical activity is inherently good. But what my research group are trying to do is trying to understand, well, why is that? Because if you know why, then you can identify a therapeutic intervention. You can identify something to target with drugs or specific exercise, or maybe certain types of physical activity are better or worse than others. So we already know that being physically active can reduce your risk of heart attacks. But a heart attack is the end point of a long, slow, chronic disease. And I'm kind of interested in what the acute response to physical activity might be. So I would describe myself as an interventional scientist. If X is related to Y, if we change X in the lab, Y should also change. So that's really what my research group are all about. And some of these things are quite complex. So although we know that physical activity is favorably associated with cardiovascular health, we also know that, for example, sleep is really good for your cardiovascular health. But physical inactivity is not good for your health. But that doesn't quite make sense to me, because it's difficult to be more inactive than when you're asleep. So why is sleep good and physical activity bad? So we try and understand these things, in our lab. Now, in the context of today, when I talk about chronic cardiovascular diseases, that might include heart attacks and strokes, but today, really, I think we're focusing on vascular dementia. So vascular dementia is that there's a known blood vessel element to that cause of dementia that's happening. And that's a long, slow process in the sense that very few people are born with vascular dementia in that sense. So it's something that we progress over the lifespan. So I'm very interested in identifying all these different lifestyle exposures and why that might explain someone's increased risk of vascular dementia. So today we're going to be talking about head impacts. Now, we know already that brain blood flow regulation is altered in people who have had traumatic brain injury. Now, of course, which I might shorten to TBI. So traumatic brain injury. Now, one traumatic brain injury is not the same as another. So sometimes I feel like it's slightly unhelpful lumping all these together and calling them traumatic brain injury. That is also true for concussion as well, which might be something we're more familiar with, perhaps in a sporting sense. You know, concussion in sport is a hot topic. So I'm kind of interested in these head impacts. I'm also interested in subconcussive head impacts. So these are the head impacts that you might get that don't lead to overt concussion. And of course, not every concussion involves a loss of consciousness, which you may know. Concussion is quite hard to therefore measure. It might be almost a silent concussion. But I'm interested in even head impacts that don't even hit that criteria, that they're subconcussive. And we measure things in my lab with regards to cerebrovascular health, so brain blood vessel health, such as neurovascular coupling and autoregulation, which I will explain in just a second. Okay, so an area of interest that's certainly in the public consciousness at the moment is how bad is heading in football for someone's risk of dementia, for example. Now, no one is getting concussed heading a football, so this is a good example of subconcussion. The act of heading a football won't lead to a concussion. You might miss the ball and hit a player's head. That could lead to a concussion, or you might hit the goalpost, for example. But just heading a football itself is unlikely to cause a concussion. And in recent years, you know, so Nobby Stiles is a good example of this, who died in 2020, was a World Cup winner in 1966. Amongst other things, at the point of death, Nobby Stiles had advanced dementia. And the family released a statement at the time. It was discussed widely in the press that heading in football had caused this vascular dementia. And that may well be the case. It's difficult to know for certain with empirical proof. And there are people who have argued now that such empirical proof does exist. But it's certainly a concern about heading in football. Nobby Stiles was also diagnosed with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, so CTE, which is something that can only be, at the moment, diagnosed post-mortem. And this is changes to brain structure that we can measure and is associated with dementia-like symptoms. So there is a fair amount of evidence suggesting that heading a football might be quote unquote bad, okay, increasing your risk. But there are, and this is really concerning because, you know, 250 million people play football around the world. It's the most popular sport that there is. So and we advocate football, you know, for health. It's important to be physically active, as I said at the top of the talk. But so some work that's come out of Professor Willie Stewart's lab up in Scotland has actually showed that people who played football professionally in the 70s we've now tracked them. They've lived long enough now to start to enter old age and start dying. Those professional footballers are 3.5 times more likely to die from neurodegenerative disease. We also know that they were almost 5 times more likely to have dementia-related medication whilst they were still alive. And interestingly, goalkeepers were only about half as likely to have dementia-related medication. So it's not just the act of being a footballer, something about football, but not being a goalkeeper that might be important. And a follow-up study on this also looked at different positions which head of the ball at different sort of frequencies in a game. And so there's an increasing burden of evidence suggesting that heading in football might increase one's risk. Now, at this point, some people, a question I often get here is, weren't the balls heavier in the 70s? That's actually not true, but the way the balls were made, they may have soaked up more water on the pitch, and the pitch may have been worse as well. And then a water-soaked ball could get heavier. So there may be something in that, but it seems to be not solely explained by the weight of the ball. Okay. And because of this, there's governing bodies have expressed concern. So in 2020, children were banned in the UK, or in England, the English FA banned heading in football in the lower leagues just during training. So it's like, look, out of an abundance of caution, let's stop heading the football. Last year, the English FA went a stage further, and they've now said that, okay, don't header in training, and also no headers in the game, please. In fact, if you purposely header the football in the game, that's an indirect free kick to the other side. So it's now punitive. It's now an offence to header the football. So again, it just shows you the direction of travel in recent years of how we've built this concern as we've learned more about heading in football. And this isn't overt concussion. This is the repeated exposure to subconcussive head impacts. So, I'm quite interested in that. Now, in my lab, as a vascular physiologist, we have an ultrasound technique that you can see our participant is wearing at the temple, which is using ultrasound, and it's measuring the velocity of blood flow through the brain. And from that, we can infer from the blood velocity trace blood flow. Now, when we header a football, provided that your heading skills are better than mine, we hit it at the front of the head, and we might get what's called a counter-coup injury at the back of the head, where the brain, which is suspended in fluid, might wobble back and forth when we headed that football. And so the back of the brain might also be damaged. Now, the back of the brain, damage sounds quite dramatic. It might be affected acutely. The back of the brain is involved in vision. And so this might be why, if you've ever had a strong blow right in front of the head, you might see stars. For example, the back of the brain has just bounced back off the skull. So we could use this ultrasound technique to look at blood flow or blood velocity through the back of the brain in response to a visual search task. So the visual search task that we use is this, everybody's favorite. It's internationally recognized. It's engaging. I work a lot with kids. And in the interest of making this talk as engaging as possible, I will give you 10 seconds to see if you can find any of the characters on the top of the screen. There will be a prize if you can find the dog, because the dog is just the tail. So I'll give you 5 more seconds. Okay, and here's the big reveal. Those are the 3. There may be more, but that's putting the slide together. I only found 3. So if you found one that I didn't, then congratulations. But whilst you were doing that, blood flow to the back of the brain would have increased because you're doing a visual search task, and we need to send more energy to the back of the brain, and the only way the energy gets there is via the blood flow. Okay, so here we can see on the screen on the left hand side we've got blood velocity on the y-axis, and we have participants have their eyes closed, and then that dotted line they do a Where's Wally, and you can increase brain blood flow. This isn't a test that we invented. This is a paper from John Smurl's lab, who was at University of British Columbia at the time. He's now at University of Calgary, so in Canada. And that group, using this test, showed that if you measured the ability to do this before and after heading a football, it is altered acutely afterwards. So in their study, to control conditions, they fired a football out of a motorized launcher to replicate the speed of a corner kick. And they had players standing 25 meters away and doing a purposeful header. They did 40 headers in 20 minutes. And afterwards, the ability to perform this test, or rather the increase in blood flow you get during that test, was altered. Now, what this means, we don't know, but it's unlikely to be good. We also know in people that might play contact sports, or people who have had a concussion and recovery from concussion, that neurovascular coupling is lower. So the fact that in healthy, these were I think about 24-year-olds, I believe, I look at the paper. The fact that neurovascular coupling is altered in people before and after heading, in the absence of any other symptoms, tells you there's some sort of silent changes going on in the brain, and I find that quite interesting. A limitation of this work is no one's doing 40 headers in 20 minutes or 40 headers in a game of football. Maybe they are in training. I wouldn't know. I was asked to stop playing football for a reason, so I'm shocking. So perhaps that happens in training, but even then, that's quite dramatic. So we wanted to kind of further this work. We also wanted to address kind of an understudied population, and that's women football players, because football or soccer in the UK is really popular. We have Lucy Bronze is a household name. So some of the footballers that we know, the Lionesses won, are reigning at the time of this recording. They are reigning European champions. And it's a growing sport. But we also know that, like for like, heading a football causes more head acceleration in a woman compared to a man, speaking in generality. And this is thought to be due to a lower neck strength, and thus the head isn't braced quite as much. There are studies looking at this in rugby where we're doing deliberate neck strengthening exercises just to keep that head stable. And there is MRI data showing white matter microtrauma is greater in women after heading compared to men. We think it's due to neck strength. Okay, so there's lots of reasons why we should be including women in this work. And so we did this work. So a similar design, we used a ball launcher to replicate a corner kick, and then our participants would header the ball purposively as if they were taking a corner and trying to go for the goal. Okay. And we did one header every 10 minutes for an hour. So only 6 headers in total, because that's more reflective of what happens in the women's game. Okay, and we published this work, and again, I just want to acknowledge UEFA for funding the study, so thanks to UEFA. And we did this neurovascular coupling test that we just mentioned, and after just doing these 6 headers in an hour, there was no change in neurovascular coupling. So we know in men, if you do 40 headers in 20 minutes, that subconcussive head impact can cause neurovascular coupling to be altered, but not so much in women. Now, we also measured some other things that didn't change in women. But that doesn't mean that heading's okay. It just means that within the scope of the study that we did, we didn't observe any changes. One of the reasons that John Smell's study that was done in Canada was so interesting, because whilst doing 40 headers might be slightly manipulative, I suppose, or to exaggerate the response, what we're trying to do is understand the long, slow, chronic, exposure and outcome. So, doing 6 headers is not going to cause dementia in people. So it's that long, slow, repeated trauma. So what would have been interesting is if we had people come back in again the next day, and then again the next day, and they keep doing it to see what would happen. Okay. The other thing that we have done to try and understand head impacts is we did some work looking at autoregulation. So let me explain autoregulation here. At the moment, I imagine you might be sitting down, and blood pressure is probably going to be quite stable, which means that brain blood flow is also going to be quite stable. If you were to stand up, what will happen is blood pressure is going to go down due to gravity. There's nothing we can do about it. Blood pressure just comes down when you stand up. Okay. Interestingly, if you were standing right now and you sat down, blood pressure goes up, actually. So when you stand up, blood pressure goes down. When you sit down, blood pressure goes up. It's just due to gravity. Now, when you stand up, blood pressure comes down and brain blood flow is going to come down a little bit because you've lost that pressure in your system. What you want is to maintain constant brain blood flow. The body's always trying to maintain constant temperature, constant energy status, constant pH. The brain really wants constant environment. So really what you want is to be on that dotted line. So even if blood pressure comes down, your body can respond to maintain brain blood flow. In some people, they might, when they stand up, they might have a real inability to regulate this brain blood flow. So blood flow comes down along with blood pressure. And that might leave people feeling a bit lightheaded. If you've ever stood up too quickly and felt a bit lightheaded, that's what's happening. Now, this tends to happen in older people, maybe who have postural hypertension. It might happen to you after exercise, for example, when blood pressure might be a little bit lower in the hour after exercise. We also know it's observed in people who've been concussed, in people who play contact sports over a course of a season, and in the heading study that John Smell did after doing 40 headers in 20 minutes. So we know that this ability, which is critical to brain function, is altered in head impacts. But as an interventional scientist, we wanted to explore that a little bit more. So what we did is we used a repeated squat stand maneuver. So we're deliberately oscillating or making blood pressure go up and down, and brain blood flow goes up and down, up and down. For 5 minutes, we do a squat, stand every 10 seconds or so for 5 minutes. And we look at blood pressure and we look at brain blood flow. Okay, so what we wanted to do is understand how the body's ability to do this might be altered by head impacts. And it's difficult in my field to recruit people to a study and then give them a head impact. Ethically, that's not something I'm allowed to do. You can do it with rodents, which is unpleasant, but people do that work. But what I can do is work with people that give themselves head impacts as part of their day-to-day. So what we really want is a pre-head impact and a post-head impact measure. Sometimes when you work with people who've had a TBI or a concussion, you don't have the pre-measure time point. So you don't really know what their normal baseline was. So this approach allows to have that normal baseline measure. So we measured autoregulation, so brain blood flow and blood pressure, before and after boxing. Now, this is with the university boxing squad. So they do 3 rounds of amateur boxing. We also did before and after sitting down, doing nothing at all for 3 rounds, just so we've got that control trial. And then, because boxing isn't just about getting hit in the head, boxing is also throwing punches and having lots of adrenaline, being very active. We wanted to make sure that we were measuring not just the effect of head impacts, but also it wasn't related to that adrenaline doing exercise. So we asked people to come in and we measured people before and after doing pad boxing, where we held up pads and they did the boxing on the pads. So they still did 3 rounds of boxing, but they just never got hit in the head. So we included that. We also had video cameras on 2 sides of the ring, where we recorded how many times people got hit in the head, and we confirmed, we independently measured that, and then we compared judges' scorecards. Okay, so we have our pad boxing trial as well, our 3 trials. Okay, and this is what we found. So again, quite a busy slide, this one, but I'll talk you through it. Essentially, and I've highlighted this in red in the top left-hand corner of your screen, there were no changes in the control trial or in the pad boxing trial to our ability to autoregulate. But in the boxing trial, before and after boxing, there was a change in the ability to regulate brain blood flow despite changes in blood pressure. What we really mean by that is phase, which speaks to how quickly your body can recover brain blood flow. So when you stand up, blood pressure comes down and your body recovers. The speed of that recovery was slower after doing some boxing, which means that we're not as good as before as maintaining brain blood flow. Now, we don't know what this means, but it's unlikely to be good. And that might frustrate some of you watching this video, but that's the honest truth. We don't. We are exploring what this means. We want to know why these things have changed. We know that we might see this chronically in people with TBI, but again, these are healthy people who had no symptoms. We tested cognitive function was absolutely fine. These individuals would have driven the minibus home, right? Perfectly legally. There was no issue with these individuals. This is a silent process that only by measuring and starting this work, we're able to detect that. We also looked at the number of punches they received and the speed of this recovery. And we see that the people who had the slowest recovery in brain blood flow received the most punches. So there's something about getting hit in the head, this is in the absence of overt concussion, that seems to be bad for brain blood flow regulation. Okay, so Paul is now going to talk a little bit, take over. I'll stop sharing my screen and invite Paul to finish off the talk and talk about some of his work from more of a metabolism perspective, and then some of the work that we're doing to try improve outcomes in people who have TBI in our lab. Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about brain energy crisis and what we can do about it. So just a little bit of background about myself. So before I started researching traumatic brain injuries, I was actually a diabetes researcher, and I spent about 8 years looking at how the brain is affected by a disease which fundamentally affects our sugar levels within our body. And I was looking at some rather niche aspects of it, and I was looking at the occurrence of low brain blood sugar, and you can see shortly how that relates to what we're going to talk about. But I switched to traumatic brain injuries partly because I play a contact sport. I play American football, which is unusual in the UK, but is something which is a growing sport. So I'm exposed to a lot of head impacts. So I thought, for my own best interest, I should probably research it. And then also, I'm surrounded by people who have head injuries all the time. I feel like I can have a much larger effect on the world by doing traumatic brain injury research. Interestingly, there's about 1 million people in the country suffering with acquired brain injuries, particularly concussions, and that's comparable to the number of people with dementia each year as well. And there's actually a lot more people like this than there are with the area of diabetes I was looking at. So anyway, so what I'm going to talk to you about is brain, blood, and energy, how we can support the brain, and then what research we are doing about it. So one key message I would like you to remember is that your brain has a sweet tooth. It's only a small organ, so it takes about 2% of your body weight, which is about 1.2 kilograms or 2.5 pounds in old money. But it uses 20% of your calories in a day, okay? So most of this actually comes in the form of sugar, all right? So we might think about healthy foods as being, healthy fats, olive oil, that kind of stuff. But your brain's main fuel source is literally sugar, okay? Now, a key thing I also want you to remember is please eat healthy foods. Don't just eat a load of sugar, okay? But, next time you're having a sweet treat, you can always say to someone, well, it's good brain fuel, okay? But the brain sugar that we use for our brain is delivered by the blood. So you can see that if we have a disrupted blood flow, as Bert's discussed, you're going to have a disrupted energy metabolism. Now, the blood also carries oxygen for the brain, also incredibly important, but also clears away waste products, right? So if we have good brain blood flow, we're going to have good brain function, more or less, okay? But sugar is the key energy source that we're thinking about today for my section. So we know that after diseases, so in neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or vascular dementias, or after traumatic brain injuries, for example, you might have an energy crisis. And there was some research showing that in rodents, after a brain injury, the ability of the brain to uptake sugar goes down. So I'll walk you through this graph and I'll put a slightly simpler version up. Can you see so hopefully you can see this laser pointer. So here we have some unaffected rodents. So I think these were mice. And basically, if you see red here, that's sugar uptake. So this is a normal level. In the injured mouse at baseline, plenty of sugar uptake, but a day later, it's gone down quite a lot. And by 5 days, it's mostly recovered, right? And we can see on this graph here on the right, the black line representing the control animals. It fluctuates a little bit, but it's relatively stable. Whereas even 3 hours after a head injury in these mice, they are less able to uptake sugar. It goes down even further by 24 hours and almost fully recovers. So what does that mean for a human? So after head injuries, our blood sugar usage goes down, so our brain is starved of fuel. It might recover partially, and this could be to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the severity of the injury, depending on repeated exposure to head injuries, such as through contact sports, or a person's own genetic makeup might predispose them to being more sensitive to head injuries. But ultimately, we might be left with this brain energy deficit, okay? So when I was thinking to myself, how do I want to approach this disease? I thought to myself, well, let's learn from other brain diseases that also disrupt brain energy. So a lot of research has gone into Alzheimer's disease. Billions of dollars and pounds have gone into Alzheimer's disease, which is fantastic. It would be nice to have some of that money for traumatic brain injury research as well, considering there's a similar number of people living with both conditions in the UK. Anyway, that aside, in Alzheimer's disease, we know that it disrupts blood sugar use, brain sugar use, okay? But there are some studies that show we can improve brain function using alternative fuel sources for the brain, okay? So there's this idea that if we can address this brain energy deficit and refuel the brain, it'll function better. Now, one of the supplements that was used was something called ketones. I'll explain what they are a little bit in a minute. The ketones were given to people with mild cognitive impairment or very early Alzheimer's disease. And they measured, it was given to them for 6 months or a placebo. It was given them 6 months, and then they measured cognitive function. And they used several measures of cognitive function, but broadly speaking, brain function improved after this 6-month trial. This was a randomized control trial, which is the kind of gold standard approach to doing these trials. And there have been several studies showing a similar effect using their particular supplement. And this seems to improve cognitive function. Now, this is in Alzheimer's disease. It's in a different disease context, but importantly, the disease mechanism of brain energy deficit is shared between traumatic brain injuries and Alzheimer's disease. So how did they do this? With ketones, right? So ketones, are they the key to brain health? Perhaps that's a strong exaggeration, but they certainly might help a little bit. And it depends specifically on the person's disease profile, perhaps. But ketones can be another source of fuel for the body. Now, the body naturally produces ketones during starvation. So if you have a very low carbohydrate diet or very low calorie diet, for example, your body will produce ketones. You might have heard of a keto diet or the Atkins diet, for example. These are ketogenic diets where the body is made to produce its backup fuel for the body. There is some evidence that these ketones have some anti-inflammatory property too, and perhaps also vascular benefits, but this is a little less clear. But we do know that ketones can readily be used by the brain in the absence of sugar. So we know that brain energy is down. We know that ketones can support brain energy, and we think that there is fairly convincing evidence that ketones improve the brain function in Alzheimer's disease. So we hypothesized and had this idea that perhaps using some even better ketogenic supplements, we could improve brain health following injury. Now, this is an ongoing study, and it's still early days yet, and we've only had, I think, 6 participants complete the study so far, and we're looking for around 20 to 30. But the principle is we're using sport concussion or sport head impacts, looking at subconcussive impacts particularly. And the idea being that this gives us a baseline to compare against, and it should also translate to other forms of concussions, so vehicle accident, violence, military implications, that sort of thing. But we took these American footballers, we measured their cognitive function, we put a little sensor in their helmets to measure how much head impact they're receiving, and then we let them go and play American football. Immediately afterwards, we would give them either a placebo or a ketogenic supplement, which I might add is a much more potent ketogenic supplement than was used in these Alzheimer's disease trials. We let them recover overnight, and then the next day retested their cognitive function. It's too early to really give anything conclusive, but we can definitely see that there is some cognitive impairment the day after and some blood flow changes, which is very important. But we need a few more participants to take part before we can really see the effects of the ketones for sure. But it's very promising early stuff. That just explains what I just said. That's okay. So where are we going to take this for future direction? So we expect that the ketones would improve brain blood flow and function of the brain, cognitive function. But we really want to test people with clinically significant or these obvious concussions, because they're the ones who might benefit the most. So if someone has a mild concussion or subconcussive head impacts, they might not have a big decrease in brain blood glucose, brain blood sugar use, for example. So the ketones will only help a little bit. Whereas if it's greatly diminished, then the ketones will have an even bigger effect, hopefully. We also want to look at people who've got this post-concussive syndrome, for example, and that's a future study which we're hoping to get funded to do. But the idea is that these are people whose brain sugar use has not fully recovered to where perhaps it once was, and then they're going to be hopefully benefit greatly from this. Now, there are some other nutrient and pharmacological or drug-based options that we're looking to pursue as well. So one of them is creatine. This is commonly used by bodybuilders or athletes. It's not going to make you suddenly look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I wish it did, But there is one study demonstrating it improved children with concussions and their outcomes. And there are dozens of papers showing it's very healthy and safe and good for generic brain functions in otherwise healthy people. So it should help even a little bit with traumatic brain injuries. And there was another recent study on vitamin B12 showing that also improved brain function post-concussion. Now, in theory, you should be able to get enough of these creatine and vitamin B12, for example, in your diet, but realistically, it's quite hard to hit these levels just through a healthy, balanced diet. So that's where these kind of nutraceutical type approaches come in to help people hit those targets. There are some drug options as well that we're exploring to improve mitochondrial function. So mitochondria are the powerhouses of your cells and are particularly active in brain tissue. And we're working on ways to help mitigate or decrease all the oxidative stress that occurs and improve their ability to produce energy. So just to summarize what I've told you today, so take-home messages basically, your brain is an adaptable organ. If we can fuel it right, we can help it help itself, okay? If I race my granny in a 100-meter race, I will probably win because my body is healthier, my muscles are healthier, my bones are healthier, okay? But if you ask me about history or something, my granny can still keep up with me because her brain is able to look after itself for a very long period in our lives. So if we can help fuel our brains properly, it will look after itself to a great extent. Will it ever be the same after an injury? Maybe not, but we can help the brain repair itself a little bit, okay? So we're working on these next generations of nutritional supplements to support brain health. And we're also spending time to unpick why the brain energy systems are disrupted by head injuries in the first place. And then we can come up with some really detailed and targeted drug-like approaches perhaps to improve brain energy. So any questions, feel free to ask them now, but also drop me an email. If you Google me, you'll find me as well, and happy to take any questions anytime. Thank you.